let's master a beat. So I have a beat here that I've essentially finished arranging, and I've finished mixing and everything like that. And so what I've done is I have all of the melodies going to one melody bus, and then I have all of the drums, 808 included this time. I don't always do that, but 808 included. All the drums going to one drum bus, and then I'm using some parallel compression to make the drums a little bit beefier and louder. And then I have my tags, and then I have all of that going to one channel. And on this channel, I have what's called my pre-master chain. And on this chain, what I like to do is do a series of like small amounts. The idea is doing it in small amounts, a bunch of different times for different frequency ranges. And the idea is if you do it enough times in small increments, you won't really notice too much change in like the sounds or the textures themselves. They'll just hopefully be louder and more present and, you know, that sort of thing. And I want the purpose of this video, as well as the majority of my videos, well, I want it to be twofold. If you don't know anything about mixing or mastering, hopefully you'll learn something from this video. And on the flip side, I am somewhat of a mastering novice myself. I've just kind of learned myself over time and through watching videos on the internet and that sort of thing. So if you're an expert in this sort of thing and you see something that I can improve, feel free to go down in the comments and let me know. So yeah, hopefully you learned something, or hopefully I learned something in the process. I already started the process of mastering this because I have everything going to one pre-master chain. So everything's going to one bus. The first thing I have on it is EQ, and you can see that I'm kind of shaving off the lowest lows and the highest highs. And one of the reasons for that is humans can't really hear those ranges very well, but also like speakers tend to not do quite as well in those extreme ranges, or at least on the low end. I'm not quite sure on the high end. I think on the high end, it just helps keep things from getting too harsh and that sort of thing. But if you have like a better explanation for the high end, I would like one. I know that for the low end, with certain speakers, if you have a lot of information in this super, super low range, it can sound bad because like the speaker's trying to put that volume out, but it like can't because it's too low in frequency, and so it oscillates at in a weird way, and it just sounds weird. I believe that's one of the reasons why people low cut their things. Again, if you have another or better, more in-depth explanation, feel free to throw that down below. But yeah, I'm cutting the lows in pretty much all these instances, as well as the extreme highs. And I'm also sometimes boosting the low lows as well a little bit. Boosting the lows, but that really is track dependent. Sometimes I want to boost the lows a little bit, sometimes I don't. It just depends on the track. So the first thing I have here is EQ, and then you'll see I have 3 instances of Maximus, and that's what I was talking about earlier, where I'm going to do compression. I'm going to do a series of compressions, and I'm doing them in different frequency ranges. And the idea is I'll shave a little bit of the dynamic range off here, a little bit there, and overall, if I've done it enough times in enough places, I'll hopefully have brought the overall volume up without destroying, the textures and the sounds that we want. Or at least that's the idea. So in this first instance of Maximus, and I've already finished this one, but I'll go through and explain what I did. I have the band set up in a very particular way. So on all of these, I'm low cutting at about 20 hertz, and I have linear phase turned on. If you don't turn linear phase on, sometimes you can get phasing issues and things can sound weird. So if you turn it on, it will help alleviate that a lot of the time. But the important part about this instance of Maximus are the bands. So if we look at the bands, we'll see how extreme they are. So this first low band is at 50 hertz, so it's 50 hertz and below. And then the extreme band is at about 10K and above. And so the idea is I want to do a little bit more on these extremes, and then in the middle I'll do a little bit of compression as well, but hopefully not too much back on. So on the low end I'm doing a little bit of compression, but then I'm also doing a little bit of what is this called? It's like the opposite of compression. It's expansion, I guess. I'm essentially turning up the volume of 50 hertz and below, but not the quietest stuff, just from here up to the loudest stuff. So I'm kind of boosting the louder things in this quieter range. But I'm also on the mid band, I'm doing something similar, but less complex. I'm essentially just doing light compression on the middle band. And you'll notice on this first band, all of my compression is up here at this 9, or by the 9. And the reason for that is because the higher up this is, the lighter the compression, or the lower the ratio is for the compression, which basically just means you're not compressing quite as much. I'm sure the less it's going to compress. And if you have it all the way up like this, you're not going to be compressing at all. So, and the further down it goes, the more you're compressing. And once you get here, you're limiting, basically. Okay, so on this first instance of Maximus, everything's pretty much up by this 9. And so my compression is very, very small. So I've got we did our low, our mids, I'm just barely compressing at all, just pushing up into the compressor a little bit. Okay, same thing with the highs, except on the highs, I'm not quite as loud, obviously, but I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm just compressing the very loudest things just a little bit, not too much. And then in the master, I'm pushing up into a compressor, again, just a little tiny bit, just getting a little bit of that dynamic range shaved down, hopefully, okay? So that's our first instance of Maximus. And again, it's the extremes, 50 hertz and below, 10K and above. Right now I'm on the second instance, and you'll get to see some of this process live because I haven't started this one yet. First thing we're going to look at are the bands. So I've pulled this band from 50 hertz up to 175, and then this upper band was pulled in from 10K down to about 5K. Okay, so I've essentially just pulled these bands in. So I'm not working with quite as extreme highs and quite as extreme lows. Things are a little bit more normalized. And then the process is going to be the same. Something I also forgot to mention is on all of my low bands, I'm merging my signal by 10%. And on all my high bands, I'm separating it by 10%. And I'm doing that in small amounts each time. Okay. That way, let's go to our lows. Okay, and I've already pulled this band down a little bit, and you can see we're compressing a little bit. And in some cases, we're not compressing at all, which is fine. And in some cases, we're compressing a little bit. So I think this is the right amount of compression. I'm not squashing down any of the signal too much. The only time I'm kind of doing that is here, but if that's the only time, I'm not too worried about it. Okay, so I pushed 0.2 up, 0.2 decibels up into this compressor, which means if I want to keep the levels the same, I need to pull this back by 0.2. So back by 0.2, okay? So, all right, now let's go to our mids. I'm not messing with the stereo on the mids, but we're gonna do the same kind of process. Okay, so it looks like I am compressing a little bit, which is fine, but I think I can compress a little bit more. So let's push into this a little bit. So we're just barely compressing that loudest stuff down. Hopefully just enough so that you won't notice it, but it will allow us to make things just ever so slightly loud. Pushed into this. We pushed into it 0.7. So to level match, we need to pull back by 0.7. Okay, let's go to the highs and do the same thing. So I'm going to pull this down so that I'm just compressing this loudest stuff, and it looks like there's one thing that gets really loud here, but everything else seems to be pretty tame. So I really want to capture this guy right here. Okay, so let's try to get this guy. Okay, so you'll notice I'm really only getting this guy and a little bit of something else, but I'm not compressing really anything else, just the loudest stuff. I think we can actually compress a little bit more into this. So let's push a little bit. So now I'm getting a little bit more of this other stuff too, okay? Just barely, probably in an unnoticeable amount, really. Okay, now we're gonna level match. So I pushed 1 decibel up, so I'm gonna pull this back by 1. Okay, now we're going to go to the master. And because we've kind of pushed some volumes up at this point, the master is probably gonna be already compressing a little bit. So let's see. It is. And I think we can compress just a tiny bit more without really noticing anything. So let's just push a little bit. I only pushed 0.2 into it. Let's go a little bit more. Okay, so I pushed 0.4 into this. Now, the only time I don't level match is when I'm on the master because I'm trying to make things louder. And the compressor is keeping things from getting too loud, hopefully. And if it's not, the limiting and compressing I'll do later will do that. So the only time I'm not level matching is on the master. So I don't care that I pushed this up 0.4. I'm going to leave this one alone. Okay. Let's go to our third and final instance of Maximus. Now, on this one, I'm going to get a little bit more particular with the bands. I'm going to actually go to the mid band and solo it so that we only hear what's in this middle band. Okay. So I'm going to hit play and just start pulling this band in until I don't hear the kick. Or the 808. Okay, and that 808 has quite a bit of like high information, high range information. So I can go pretty high with this. I'm not going to go too much past here though. So now I'm going to do the same thing with this upper band and pull this in until I don't really hear the hi-hats. Now I already really don't hear them, so I don't have to go too far. Okay, so this is really where that clap snare sound is sitting. Okay, now at this point the process is going to be identical. Okay, so I'm going to unsolo it just so we can hear everything together. Right, and now let's go to the lows. Down, but it looks like this is already going straight up to the bar, so I'm just going to push into this compressor just a little bit. Okay, so I'm pushing up into this by 0.6. So to level match, I'm going to pull this back by 0.6. Okay, let's go to the mids. Now, again, we did the mids in a particular way, so the loudest thing in the mids right now should be that main clap or that main snare based on how we did the bands. So let's look and see it in here. We can see that. The loudest thing is in fact that clap snare. Okay, so at this point what we're trying to do is we want to, so this is a clap snare, but so is this. And you can like visually see there's a height difference between these two, like pretty big difference actually. And we want to kind of minimize that. We want to make it so that most of the claps and most of the snares are more or less the same level. I mean, if that includes squashing a sound horribly, then go back to the mix and change something because you probably messed something up. But this kind of thing we can do in the mastering stage. So let's pull this up to until we're just barely compressing on the highest end. So let's hit play here. So we're just barely compressing on the very loudest stuff. Let's push a little bit more into that. Okay. So I pushed 0.8. So let's pull this back by 0.8. All right. And something else I like to do with my clap snares at this point is I like to use the expansion function of this just to kind of make the loudest part of my main clap or main snare just a little bit more noticeable or a little bit more loud, you know? So I'll bring this dot up so that basically I'm only capturing the main clap snare. So if you look at the right side over there, anything above that orange line is basically the clap snare. The exception is that rim, but I'm okay with also affecting the rim in this way, and you'll see what way I'm talking about. What I'm going to do is hit play so we can hear it and see it. And then I'm going to take this and I'm going to raise it up like this, and it's going to make anything that is in this range, so above this orange line, it's going to make it just a little bit louder. And you can see that right here. You can see it's causing those little things to be just a little bit louder. Just kind of, okay, and I might not want to do it quite as much. Let's pull it back a little bit. Let's go to the highs. Now on the highs here, I'm really focusing on like making sure that the clap snare isn't the loudest thing in this range, because I want my hi-hats and my crashes to be the most prominent thing in this higher register. So if the clap snare was really loud in this section, I would probably do some more compression to this to make sure it wasn't the most prominent thing in this section. Kind of like what's happening here with this rim. So this rim is getting compressed a little bit, and that's a good thing. I don't want the rim to be necessarily the loudest or most prominent thing in this high register. So I'm actually going to push into this a little bit more just to make sure that other things are also as loud in this register. You can see I'm actually doing what I was talking about. I'm actually compressing the clap. And I'm not compressing any of the hats here, except for right here, which I'm okay with. Let's go to the master. And on the master again, we don't need to worry about level matching. Did we have to do that here? Oh, I forgot to level match. Okay, so I pushed this up by 1.8. So let's pull this down by 1.8. Okay. And again, I'm not going to level match because I'm on the master. So I'm trying to push things up into the compressor. All right, let's go to the next thing in the chain. I need to delete this limiter. I don't know why it's there. Okay, I've got two instances of patcher. So the first one is I don't know what to call it. It lets you put things in mono versus the separated field. So I tend to, these are the low frequencies. I tend to pull them into mono. So if you pull this all the way down, it's like pulling it all the way into mono. And if you push it all the way up, it's like pushing it all the way into the separated field. So I tend to pull the lower frequencies in mono, push the higher frequencies out to the sides, and then you can kind of play with the middle frequencies a little bit. I like to kind of do the opposite, but that's kind of to taste. The next patcher preset is mid-side EQ. So let's look at the sides. I like to pull in, make sure I don't have too many sub-frequencies on the sides, because, and again, if you have a better way of explaining this, please do in the comments. But from my understanding, it's because on the sides, well, for one, you can't really, it's hard to hear where sub-frequencies are coming from. So if you have it coming from the sides, it's going to be kind of pointless. And I think another reason why is because if you have a lot of information in the separated field as well as in the mono field, it can sound like muddy and like, I don't know how to describe it. It can like mess up the low end and make it sound weird. So I like to cut the lows essentially on the separated field. And again, if you have like a better way of explaining why that might be a good thing, or if what I'm doing is a bad thing and you have an explanation for why, please feel free to share that in the comments. So now that's the sides. For just the mids, I'm doing something similar with an EQ, but on just the mids, I like to throw a little bit of saturation on it. That way, like my kick, my snare, clap, whatever is in the mids that's getting really loud is pushing into a little bit of saturation. I just like the way that sounds. Okay, and then on the mids, I have another EQ, and again, I'm cutting the low lows and then the high highs. Right, the next thing is another EQ. This one's probably redundant. I probably don't need this EQ because I've done it so many other times. And then I have a wave shaper, which I push about 5% extra volume into this. And sometimes I make the low stuff a little bit distorted and louder. Sometimes I don't. It depends on the track. But I usually push this to 105% so that it's pushing up into, and this is a hard clipper, by the way. I forgot to mention that. This is a hard clipper in the Fruity Wave Shaper. And you can see it's getting loud enough so that the loud stuff is getting hard clipped off the top. And again, you could push sometimes I like to do this and kind of make the quieter stuff a little bit louder and distorted. It just kind of depends on the track. And then after the Wave Shaper, I have a limiter, and because I've hard clipped a little bit, I can push a little bit of extra volume into this limiter. Usually I can go about 0.2, 0.3 before any limiting happens. I can't talk. Okay, so that's my pre-master chain. I've done a bunch of compression, basically, some clipping, and a bunch of EQ, and limiting, basically. And then I also push things in the stereo field, mono versus separated. Let's save it, just in case things crash. And then now I'm going to go to my master, and I have a master chain that I like to use. And it's kind of the same thing, so master preset. So I've got an EQ, which is just cutting the lows again. And then I have 2 compressors and a limiter. So this limiter is basically just to monitor things. And then I have 2 different compressors. One is kind of normal, where I have a 3-to-1 ratio. I'm bringing this down to 9 decibels for the threshold, and then I'm pushing it up a couple of decibels of gain, and I've got a slow attack, kind of faster release. And just that alone is mixed out. And if you turn it off, you can hear a little bit of a difference. If I mix this all the way on, you will hear a difference. Okay, it's a little bit louder. Sometimes I don't want to use a compressor like this much or this aggressively, so I'll mix the signal back. Okay, I think that sounds good. And then on this second compressor, it's a bit ridiculous. I'm kind of over compressing, and that's the point of this one. I have 0 attack and a slow release, 3-to-1 ratio, but then I'm pulling the threshold down by 30 decibels and then pushing it up by 20. So I'm compressing this a ton, essentially. It's almost like I'm pushing it into like a limiter and then pushing the volume way up. But the purpose of this one isn't to be mixed all the way on. Like this one I could have mixed all the way on. Sometimes that sounds good, and I like that. Sometimes I don't. This one I never do. I always have this one mixed out, and the reason for that is because I'm over compressing it way too much. So if I just have this mixed all the way on, here's what it sounds like. You can hear things like pumping in and out, and it's like way too much, obviously. So usually this is mixed back like 10%, 15, 20 at most, you know, like it's mixed way back, just kind of to taste. Okay, and then the next thing in our chain is one more instance of Maximus. So on this, I'm doing the same thing that I did on the third instance of Maximus on the pre-master chain. So I'm going to solo the mid band, and then I'm going to play with the bands until I get rid of the kick and the hi-hats. Right there is fine, doesn't need to be perfect, but then the process will be basically the same after that. So and now the difference on this instance of Maximus and all the others, on all the other ones I was compressing. So on the first instance I was compressing up here by the 9, then I brought it down by the 6. I didn't really explain this earlier, by the way. And then on the third one you might have noticed I brought it down by the 3. So I was kind of compressing more as I went. This time I'm limiting, which means instead of being here, you know, or here where I'm compressing quite a bit, I'm limiting. If you want to know the difference between compression and limiting, you probably want to watch a different video. I think the difference is a limiter is just a compressor with like an infinite ratio. I think if you have a better explanation or a more in-depth way of explaining the difference, feel free to do so in the comments down below. But I believe that's what the difference is just a compressor with an infinite ratio basically is essentially a limiter. All right, so I'm limiting this time instead of compressing. So let's, but the process is exactly the same. So let's go. Is the right number. So, okay, so I've pushed into this 0.2, so I need to level match and pull this back by 0.2. Now we're gonna go to the mids and do the same thing. Okay, so I pushed 0.6 into this, so I'm going to pull this back by 0.6. Go to the highs. Okay, I pushed up 1 decibel, so I'm going to pull this back by 1. Let's go to the master. Limiter, so it's keeping it from going above 0. So, okay, let's go to the next thing. I've got another EQ. Okay, same thing. Again, this one might be redundant. A couple of these might be redundant if I'm being honest. I'm also boosting the lows a little bit here. Let's go to patcher again. So this is another instance of the like stereo thing in patcher. So I'm pulling the lows a little bit into mono, pushing the highs a little bit into the separated, and then doing the opposite with the middle. Oh, okay. And then the last thing I'm going to do in the master chain is I have a limiter, a soft clipper, and then a U-lean loudness meter. I'm going to look at that last, okay, because that's going to be the last thing we do is look at the values. But before we look at the values, I want to push this to be as loud as I think I can get it. So let's look at the limiter, and visually I'm going to kind of make a decision on what I want to do, as well as based on what I hear. Okay, so it looks like I can probably pull this down to about there. And what I'm looking at are like the loudest things and then like the next loudest things. If you look, like this is the loudest part of this little section, and then next to it there's a part that isn't quite as loud. And so what I'm looking for is like how much can I reduce that gap across the board without destroying the sound. And it looks to be about here. So, okay, so I've pulled the ceiling down by 1.1. Okay, so let's put that back. So 1.1 is what I think I can push into a soft clipper before the sound starts to get like too destroyed or, you know, too squashed. So let's try that. So I'm going to put this limiter after a soft clipper, and then I'm going to come up here and push 1.1 decibels. And you'll notice now, like if you look across the top, it looks a little bit more uniform. Like this little guy right here kind of used to be a little bit further down. The gap between the loudest parts and the next loudest parts has been reduced. And that's kind of the point of this, is to shave off as much as you can without really noticing too much, so that you can bring the volume of everything else up to make the loudness of the entire track higher. I think we can. So now what I'm going to do is turn on this U-lean loudness meter, and this is free. You can go download it for free online. You don't get some functionalities with the free version, but it's still a super awesome tool that you can use to like look at a bunch of different important values. So let's turn it on, and then I'm going to hit play here in just a second. But what I'm going to be looking at are two numbers. And if you have useful information for what I'm explaining, please feel free to throw it in the comments. But I'm mostly just looking at this LUFS number, the LUFS number, which is going to be right here, integrated LUFS. And then I'm looking at the true peak max. So I really don't want this number to be above 0. And if it ever goes above 0, I'm going to reduce the volume of the whole track so that that doesn't happen. And this number is, I'm still trying to figure out a good value for that. What I've noticed is -7 is pretty loud for a beat without vocals on it. And then -10 is on the more quiet side. So I usually try to shoot somewhere in there. So -7, -9, -8. I usually shoot for somewhere in the -8s, basically, is what I'm shooting for. But sometimes it's not quite as loud. It really depends on the track. For this one, I think I want it to be a little bit louder. So I probably want to shoot for closer to -8, -7. So let's hit play and see what it looks like. Okay, so it looked like I was in around the range I thought I would be in. I was actually a little bit louder than I thought I was going to be. And then this true peak value down here got up to 0.4, which is above 0. Obviously, it's a positive number. So since that got above 0, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to this limiter, and I'm going to pull this down by 0.4, and then I'm going to let that play again, and then see if that goes above 0 this time, okay? Okay, so you'll notice this number never got above 0. It stayed at -0.0, which is what I'm looking for. And also this number is still this is a pretty loud beat in general. So I'm going to actually let this run a little bit more. So I'm going to let this run a little bit beforehand and then into this. So let's let it run for the entire second half of the beat, basically. And I'm just going to kind of look at this and make sure that this number doesn't go above 0. And I'm just kind of looking at this number. If this number gets too extreme, I might make some adjustments over here with the compressors and the limiters. But yeah, let's just let this run for a second and see what things look like. Okay, so evidently I wasn't at the loudest part of the song. I thought I was, but I wasn't, because I'm now going above 0. So I'm at 0.1. So let's go back to the limiter, and I'm going to pull this back by 0.1, and let's run it again. Okay, so as we can see, I never got above 0 this time. So I believe at this point I am finished. So I'm going to turn off the Julian loudness meter because I don't need it. It's essentially just there so I can look at things and see how loud I'm getting and look at the values. If you have a little bit more insight on what you should be doing and looking for when it comes to these numbers, please feel free to throw them in the comments. Like I said, the main thing I'm looking for is making sure that this doesn't go above 0. And then I'm looking at this number just to get an idea for how loud my song is overall. And typically, I'm shooting for negative in the -8s, -9, sometimes, and then -10 if it's on the quiet side. I've noticed for quieter parts of songs. But yeah, if you have a little bit better insight for how to use this tool, feel free to throw that down in the comments of the beat. So I'm just going to hit play here, and then I'll probably let it ride for a second, and that'll be it.